Tworek is an instructor at the Harvard Extension School. His research and teaching focuses on the history of education, intellectual and cultural life of early modern Europe from transcontinental and global perspectives. Concurrently, Dr. Tworek is also the CEO and co-founder of Polis, an ed tech startup based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that has grown out of his research and teaching. And he's also, I'll note, currently part of a select alumni cohort of companies at the iLab at Harvard Business School. Today, he's going to be sharing with us some of his multifaceted experience in a talk entitled Academic Entrepreneurship, Lessons from History. Dr. Tworek, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Stuart. I want to thank Professor McManus, Professor Yellen, Basma, and the Research for Institute for the Humanities for inviting me to speak with all of you today. I'm just so delighted to see friends, colleagues I've obviously known from grad school and being able to catch up with them. I just want to thank everyone who's here today as well. And I'm just absolutely excited to share my experience with all of you and get our discussion going. So to get started, just to give you a sense of our agenda for today. So our roadmap will be pretty simple. First, I'll talk about entrepreneurship in the humanities. And I don't want this talk to be thought of as a conventional academic talk that focuses just on some of my research. It's more of a TED Talk, more of talking about my journey to the startup world, talking about obviously entrepreneurship in the humanities, which makes sense, talking about how my research as a historian and my teaching as an educator has been indispensable to my work as a startup founder, or as I like to call myself now, an academic entrepreneur. And then, concluding with some advice, some lessons that you can apply to yourself from my own personal history for studying history, humanities, and what to do with it in the 21st century. And of course, don't worry, we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion from the audience afterwards. So when you think of successful entrepreneurs, who comes to mind? I bet I could guess some of the people who might instantly come to your mind. Perhaps Steve Jobs with Apple. Perhaps maybe Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, or Meta as it's called now. And almost certainly, perhaps Elon Musk with Tesla and SpaceX. These well-known examples have come to define what we could call the Silicon Valley model of a successful startup founder in tech. So essentially, if you want to become a startup founder in tech, the stereotype is you have to be bright, intelligent, potentially have a difficult personality, be about 20-something-ish in age, wear a hoodie. Sorry, I didn't bring mine today. I felt like maybe a suit would be a little bit more appropriate. You have to hunch over your laptop in a poorly lit garage in Silicon Valley and believe that you're on the verge of creating the next billion-dollar unicorn company. Luckily, I think for all of us here today, the reality of who is a successful startup founder is very, very, very different from this common perception. First of all, successful founders are much older than 20. So if we look at this graph for founders in the US, we see that the average age of successful founders is about 41.9 years. So saying basically most of these founders that we find who are successful from this survey are in their late 20s to early 40s, which for me personally is good. They're also much more diverse. We find that founders are actually coming from many different backgrounds, obviously different genders, backgrounds not just in terms of where they're from geographically, but also socioeconomically, which is very, very important, very, very essential as well. We also see, contrary to the idea of the college dropout being essential to success of a startup founder, that education matters for founders. And I should add, especially pointing out with this graph here, that about 10 to 15% of these successful founders have PhDs, right? And even more if you count advanced degrees. So one question that might occur to you from this data is, Where do those with humanities degrees figure in this picture? Well, of course, there are examples of corporate leaders with humanities degrees who are often cited as testaments of success, right? We have Susan Wojcicki, for instance, who is the CEO of YouTube, who studied history and literature at Harvard. We have Carly Florentino, for instance, who studied medieval history and went on to become the CEO of Hewlett-Packard, right? A very large printer company, right? We also have the example of Howard Schultz, who also studied the humanities, who went on to create Starbucks, both as a founder and then ran it as its CEO for quite a while. So obviously these examples, give us a lot to think about, but when we look at the data, we see that these anecdotes are not as convincing. If we look at the S&P Global's findings, only 1.5% of vice presidents and C-suite executives in the US have graduated in a humanities or liberal arts degree field. So we see the picture is very, very, very different. But that doesn't mean that the humanities don't matter. If we look at even some of the most prominent tech founders, some of them actually have humanities backgrounds, right? We can look at the founder of Lynda, or what is now LinkedIn Learning, for those of you who use LinkedIn, Linda Wyman, who studied the humanities, had a design background before creating this site for learning that LinkedIn acquired not too long ago. We could look to right below her to Stuart Butterfield, who is the creator of Slack, a communication messaging platform that aims to replace email as a means of communicating at work or even personally. He himself has no technical background and studied philosophy. Of course, we have Jack Ma, who studied English literature and was an English teacher for a long time before he went on to create Alibaba. And of course, returning full circle to Steve Jobs, who is very well known not only for having not finished his college degree, but emphasizing the importance of his major, which was called creative humanities, and the influence of studying that along with philosophy and other liberal arts subjects in helping him envision and create Apple, and by extension, the iPhone, according to some people. But even with those noted examples, again, we see that the humanities feature among fewer founders if we look at the data surveyed across some of the most successful founders, right? We see that computer science especially is disproportional. And for some reasons, obviously it makes sense if you're building something that's tech related. But the bigger question that we ought to ask ourselves as humanists, as people who are engaged in the humanities, is how can we make the humanities matter in a startup world dominated by STEM? Of course, this is a question that many have taken up, and this is a discussion that pundits and entrepreneurs in tech have brought up in a variety of different articles, arguing for a variety of different reasons why tech needs the humanities. Here are some of the most common ones. First, the interpretation of data. That's why tech needs humanities. They need someone who can think about data and how data is created and consider potential biases that might be around it, right? Especially in light of how some data have been used, especially big data, towards applications, towards humans, individuals, or towards other business applications. Impact is another reason that's given why the humanities need to be part of this tech world. Impact in terms of thinking how technology might impact humans. For instance, if you create a platform that essentially makes thousands, if not maybe tens of thousands of people unemployed, what are the social consequences of that technology, right? Another area that's pointed out is ethics. What is right, what is fair, what is best for us as humans in, say, creating a particular piece of technology. This area often comes when we talk about AI, artificial intelligence, or machine learning and its applications, and perhaps maybe some of our fears of whether or not this technology might replace us one day. Another important area is I like to call is context. And you can tell I'm a historian here because that's something I think about all the time, even when I'm talking with non-historians in this space. Context in terms of, well, what's been the history of this technology, right? History of technology used for transportation or for education or whatever it might be. And what are some of the past paths that have led up to where we are today? And of course, last, and I think this is one that is quite essential and important, is horizon expansion. This is often what's argued as one of the most consequential parts of having humanists as a part of this tech space, is that our expertise and experience and knowledge in the humanities gives us new paths for creation and innovation, right? We open new windows or give new perspectives or ask questions that perhaps someone who's so involved in tech or so involved in a particular area of STEM might not have considered. And I would say these last two, context and horizon expansion, I see as absolutely essential, not only to my own journey to academic entrepreneurship, but for anyone else who's considering or thinking about that path. So I want to transition now, after having talked a little bit about entrepreneurship and the role of the humanities and some of the things that go into what founders bring to the table, especially those who are successful, to talk about my own journey to it. So there are really four kind of main signposts I want to outline in my journey that I've seen as important towards it. Obviously, talking about being a historian, talking about my experience as an educator, as an educator in both higher ed, but also in high school and variety of other kind of areas outside of that as well. As a consultant, someone who's applied expertise and tried to advise people to implement a variety of solutions from that expertise. And then, of course, leading up to becoming an entrepreneur and taking those insights and experiences and applying it to solving a real world problem. So first, let's begin with my interest in history. So I did my undergraduate degree at a small liberal arts college studying classics initially. And then I met a wonderful professor who is a specialist in the Renaissance and is still a very dear friend and mentor to me today. And I took his course on early modern Europe, and he absolutely hooked me on the topic of the Renaissance. So as someone who grew up speaking Polish, getting into this topic of the Renaissance and classics, one of my first questions when I started studying this field was, well, where was Poland in the Renaissance history that I had been reading? And you might ask, well, why Poland? Well, it isn't just because of my background. So if we look at this map here that we have in the corner here, we obviously have Cicero, we obviously have the creation of Adam, by Michelangelo representing the Renaissance. And then we have that map in the corner where we see Poland, which is very different in the 16th century compared to what we know about it today. It was a republic of nobles, it was multi-religious, it was an important part of major European developments. And as someone who grew up in that particular culture, I kept on asking, well, why isn't this part of the history that I'm reading about in the US? Then I did a master's degree in teaching. Got to teach Latin in Texas, got to teach social studies, a lot of really other cool subjects. But ultimately, I decided to return to research. And for my research topic, I combined my interest in Renaissance history, obviously in Poland, and then also this emerging interest in education, something that I saw bringing together these different trends and connections and interests that I had. For instance, Erasmus, the person pictured here, was a major scholar and educator in the 16th century who attracted students from all over Europe. And this reputation and this fame, indeed, it's so important that he today is the namesake for the EU Study Abroad program. But what I noticed as I continued studying and refining this aspect of my research, this interest in Renaissance education in Poland, was that many scholars of the Renaissance and of education had really neglected why Erasmus had so many students that had come from Poland and this whole region. It seemed to be almost a footnote. And for me, I wanted to understand why these students traveled so far to see this person and why was it so important. So during my PhD at Harvard, I researched why these students from Poland, as well as Central and Eastern Europe, traveled to study with famous scholars in other parts of Europe in the 16th century. And of course, one key reason, and it's something that will connect me with Professor McManus as we studied with the same advisor, is Renaissance humanism, the movement to revive ancient languages and literatures, to reform education, culture, and society. That began roughly in the 14th century and became popular at universities in Italy, especially in the 16th century. Though Renaissance humanism had arose largely against how teaching was done at universities in the beginning, so really a reaction like, oh, I can't bear what's being taught at universities. Let's do some informal learning outside of it. I discovered as I engaged in this research on these students from Poland that they sought out famous humanists like Erasmus and traveled specifically to famous universities in Italy and Central Europe to gain humanist learning there. And for several reasons. First, to gain eloquence and classical learning, Second, to make useful connections with famous professors and become part of prestigious communities like the Republic of Letters, right? And third, to use both knowledge, connections, and this community to enhance their social standing and political standing at home. I use both textual and historical methods, along with quantitative and digital ones, to build a database of these students to better understand the intellectual and social impact of study abroad in the 16th century. So in addition to also doing my PhD on this topic, bringing together education and the Renaissance, I also happened to meet my lovely wife, who is a historian as well. So obviously with my dissertation in hand, variety of historical methods and knowledge in place, and a happy personal life, I graduated in 2014 and prepared to enter the academic job market. However, I discovered that when I entered in 2014, the job market then was not so great, and unfortunately still isn't. The AHA, which is listed from where I get this information here from, the American Historical Association, is the professional association for historians in the US. And they've tracked job market for historians for many, many years. So when I graduated in 2014, as you can see, the job gap, basically, the gap between the number of jobs and the number of newly minted PhDs, especially for where I am in my field of study, early modern Europe, was quite huge. So clearly, in light of this trend, in light of this gap, which is still a problem today and is one of the kind of major reasons behind my startup as well, I knew I had to think of multiple other options if I wanted to find work. So I became a lecturer on history and literature at Harvard, where I gained a lot of experience advising and mentoring students on projects, theses, variety of topics and research. I also became a lecturer in the history department, where I taught a large lecture course on early modern Europe, which helped me to broaden my research and really make it accessible to a larger audience. And finally, I began teaching a seminar on research methods at the Harvard Extension School. So the Harvard Extension School is part of Harvard that is dedicated to providing courses and degree programs for non-traditional students who could range in age from 18 to 85 years. So quite a wide variety, right? So teaching at the Extension School introduced me to a whole different group of students and their needs. But it also introduced me to something that would really be very consequential for me, especially in my entrepreneurial activity, teaching online, teaching on Zoom, teaching on a virtual platform. So as you can see, my teaching at the Extension School would lead me to a lot of interesting later ideas from my startup, showing how teaching can also inform entrepreneurship, not only research. Of course, I didn't just stay within the confines of the university to find my next career path. I was accepted as one of 2 humanists to the Boston Consulting Group's summer internship program to see if consulting was the right fit for me. As a historian, I was able to provide insights and solutions on various business projects, which my STEM colleagues hadn't considered in various activities that we did. The experience validated my training as a historian and that we had something valuable to offer beyond academia. This interest led me also to collaborate with educational organizations and companies in the Boston area who were looking for my expertise and gave me the ability to apply that expertise and my experience to real life business problems they had. For instance, I developed a modern application from my research on medieval student life that could help modern practitioners of study abroad, as I did with the example here from the Boston Area Study Abroad Association, which was quite a fun thing to do to bring in those insights for modern study abroad students. My consulting work led to many potential opportunities to work for educational companies. But I decided to take a less secure route, slightly less secure, and start my own company, which was called Cambridge Humanities Group, or CHG. With this first company, my major reason was that most of the educational companies that I worked with did not have an educator as a part of their leadership team. And this often led to misaligned expectations in terms of what good educational practices should be when you're applying it to a business setting or you're expecting to make money from education. So I founded CHG specifically to bring that perspective, but also to better connect educators, PhDs, and adjuncts with paid on-site teaching opportunities. And over the few years, was it 3-4 years that we worked on CHG before Polis, we worked with companies from China, from Mexico, from the US, and Europe. It was really incredibly successful. However, at some point in this company, which was more of a consultant, and that's an important difference here, we realized that there were certain limits of on-site opportunities for our growing rosters of educators, being able to place them, being able to get as many people for them, right? Their logistical challenges. And that we wouldn't be able to solve this problem, these limits, without the help of technology. To change that, I founded Polis. I have two wonderful co-founders, one of whom was my colleague from when I was a PhD student. He was my supervisor, who went into administration as well as to biotech. And my other co-founder is an ML software engineer who used to send rockets into space. So together we've pulled our educational, business, and technical expertise and experience to reform higher education. The goal is really simple: to build an online republic of letters modeled on the Renaissance one, to create a more impactful opportunities for professors and students to connect outside of universities. Fortunately, we have paying clients and we have a very active community of users on our platform. And of course, this application of my own research and interests in history have been recognized by different prestigious programs, including one at the iLab at Harvard Business School. The moral of this story that I want to emphasize here is that my research, teaching, and experiences from my PhD in history enable me to create solutions for real world problems. But you might ask, is my example, my story, true for other academics and PhDs? Well, sure. There's a great example with Coursera, which was founded by Daphne Koller and Andrew New, two professors at Stanford who drew on their own research and teaching in computer science to create an educational company whose current valuation is nearly $2 billion USD. Yes, of course, there are many PhDs and advanced degrees among successful startup founders, but many of them are not historians or in the humanities, as we can see here. Disproportionately, the ones who go in are in biotech or in some areas computer science. However, that should not dissuade you from thinking about how you can apply your expertise and experience in the humanities to real world problems. And here are some of the lessons I've learned from having worked with many of these PhDs and professors who go into the entrepreneurial space, who have come from science, technology, and more STEM disciplines. So why do these PhDs dominate so much more? And why is there a gap where we from the humanities are not present? Well, at least from what I've learned, the reason is threefold. First, their research, STEM PhDs and graduates in these areas often has a practical application to solve real world problems, and often framed in that way too. Of course, there are ones who work on more theoretical research components, but there's a strong culture of thinking about practical applications to solving real world problems. Second, there are people out there, there's a market out there who are willing to pay for these practical applications and to use them from their research, from these PhDs research to solve their problems, right? Thinking very consciously about them. And of course, third, investors being willing to back companies based on such research, since it's proprietary, monetizable, and scalable. And these are very key components where we can learn a lot as humanities graduates, as PhDs, as researchers in this area, to think how can we adapt those kind of insights, those approaches to what we do best. So one of the things that we really, really do well in the humanities is asking analytical questions. And here are some starting questions for all of you to consider about your own area of study. And to help, I'm going to go through and kind of give you a sense also of how I would answer some of these questions myself. And hopefully these will be good questions also to prompt us as we get to the discussion part of the talk. So for the first one, how does my area of study or research address a real world problem and potentially solve it for people? So for that one, I would say my own research on the history of education has given me examples of how people in the past have tried to reform higher education. looking at the Renaissance, looking at Renaissance humanists and how they turned to different forms of community and communication to reform and create a new way of learning. Yeah. For the second question, how my teaching can attract a broader audience for my area of expertise. For that one, my online teaching of older students at the Extension School gave me an insight into an underserved market who could benefit from more personalized education. For the third question, how can my skills and experience be applied to academic and non-academic areas? Well, my consulting experience working with companies, especially educational ones, made me realize that those kinds of businesses often lacked educator and teaching perspectives in making business decisions. And bringing those perspectives in, especially when you're working in a specialized field like education, is particularly important. And of course, there are many other areas where humanists can influence other than education, but in that particular area, there's a very strong synergy between us, humanists and educators. And for the fourth and final one, how can I build connections and relationships with people that will enable me to start an enterprise? Well, my connections and relationships with colleagues, friends, former students from university and from academia have been crucial to building this endeavor, from connecting me to clients, introducing me to investors, as well as building a new community of learning for the 21st century. I'm very excited to talk with all of you, hear about some of your thoughts and concerns and interests as well in the humanities and where you're thinking about applying. And thank you again, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that tremendous presentation. It is really interesting to hear your story and to hear about all the successes you've had, and of course to hear about the Renaissance as well, which is.
I knew you'd love that.
Yeah, exactly. So we have plenty of time for questions and comments and pitches even. So we have you can either type in the chat or you can also turn on your microphone if you like as well. But I might start us off. I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit more about your platform, Polis? I know about it, but maybe some of the others in the room haven't heard about it. Could you tell us a little bit about the sort of kind of the innovative approach to education that it facilitates?
Absolutely. One of the key ways of thinking about Polis is that we help, through our platform called Polis, we help universities solve student attrition and improve learner engagement by connecting their students with the world's best educators in a cost-effective way. So that's often when I get that question, I get asked by a non-academic or investor, you can see kind of the main value props, right? You help someone solve a problem by connecting them to a resource more efficiently or more effectively to solve a problem which is basically causing them a loss of money or a loss of users, et cetera, et cetera. When I answer this educationally, Polis is a way of democratizing access to the world's best educators to make higher ed more accessible, more affordable, and more full of opportunities for people to benefit from. And this comes from my own perspective and knowledge, having been, for instance, an adjunct and having to kind of figure out, how do I find the best kind of job as an educator? And for me, that's one of the motivations behind the platform, is to be able to create a way for educators, PhDs, who are underemployed or unemployed, and there's about almost 1.2 million of them in the US alone, to find ways for what they study, their expertise, whether it's humanities, whether it's science or social sciences, to be able to create value for it. So it's a marketplace essentially, and that's what's really quite unique about it, right? And one way it's a republic of letters, but it's also a marketplace of ideas, where unlike older forms of these kind of communities, like the Republic of Letters, educators get paid for their expertise, for their experience, and they're connected with people who want to enjoy their expertise. And by doing this, we're hoping to actually promote a better way for universities to engage and employ educators, a better way for learners to access what we think are world's best educators in a more cost-effective and efficient way. And then for educators to break the mantra of scholar doesn't rhyme with dollar and create a way for them to actually earn a way that is more in line with their qualifications.
Oh, wow, that's a great ambition, or a great series of different ambitions. You have all right. Javier's heading off, but yeah. So I mean, you obviously had to sort of build a platform to facilitate this. It sounds a little bit, I guess, like Uber in some ways, or some of these other sort of matching type apps.
Absolutely.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that sort of technical, that's a technical side?
Absolutely, and I'm hoping my technical co-founder will not be angry with me if I misrepresent any of the technical parts. But very simply, as you said it, we're bringing in insights from other firms that are out there. The marketplace model of Airbnb, right? Creating a basically an opportunity for educators to better create value for their time, excess time, for instance, right? The Uber model, where you do have some more on-demand access to educators for needs that you might have, or being able to access educators outside of traditional forms, just like drivers and taxis, right? Breaking down that kind of traditional industry. We also have a matching component. That's why we use ML. We use quite a bit of that in the kind of matching, assessment, and a variety of other kind of parts that we build out that's proprietary to create a better experience, right? To use human, but also augment it with machine learning and artificial intelligence to make things much more efficient and to be able to find the thing that you need as a learner quickly, right? And that's one of the things that we work on in that experience. So it's essentially bringing together a lot of different trends that we've seen in tech. The Uber kind of Uberification component, the Airbnb component of a marketplace, the matching component, which you could always say it's dating, but we make it for education, of course, right? Make it much more optimal for them. And then obviously, we're always very mindful as an ed tech company that there are major downsides to those technological developments, right? Each one of them, whether it's Airbnb, whether it's Uber, whether it's even freelance platforms like Upwork, how do you create a platform with a population that might not always benefit from it, right? We've seen that with taxi drivers at Uber. We've seen with disruptions to real estate and housing through Airbnb. And part of what we do is to be mindful very clearly that there are limits to what you can do in education and ed tech, that there are certain kind of priorities that perhaps maybe limit us, perhaps financially, but empower us in terms of the educational impact. And I think that's when you're exactly as a humanist thinking in tech, you try to find that right balance. And you ask yourself, are you ultimately serving the technology, or are you ultimately using technology to serve the human? And I would say the latter is our goal in terms of how we leverage technological models, but also technology itself in Polis.
Yeah, we had a great talk last term from somebody at Oxford who talked about putting the humans back into digital humanities. We have to remember that we're serving people, and people are part of the process of production as well. So yeah, we really shouldn't forget that. So I guess a sort of bigger question that many of us might be asking is, what do you think the biggest difference was in moving to become an entrepreneur?
That's a great question.
Because you spoke a lot about the similarities and the synergies, but there are obviously differences as well. And I'm wondering, were you just a sort of naturally entrepreneurial in spirit, which I think, certainly in comparison to myself, you're a man of many hidden talents. But you obviously there's some new things you had to learn along the way. So I was wondering, could you talk about that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think that's an important one that is often, I think for the sake of narrative, I kind of slightly less, but I'm glad that someone asked that question. I was hoping for such a question because there is a lot that needs to be added and complemented, right? Like I would say, whenever you hear people say, well, just being a humanist is enough to go into this area. You don't need to learn anything else. I'd be very wary, because you do need to learn a lot of new skills, right? You have to be prepared to adapt new things, learn about business, learn about whatever might be the priority in the area that you're going into. And that was a major part of this. When I started this in 2017, 18, I had a lot of kind of, as you mentioned, like entrepreneurial knack. I don't know if it's just from my background or upbringing. But yeah, that's not necessarily, necessary. You can acquire all those kind of intuitions or interests as well. And I see a lot of people who do that extremely well. I think part of it is that experience teaches you quite a bit. Sometimes people might think, well, if you want to do that, go and do an MBA. I definitely wouldn't recommend that for cost reasons. And, experience I found to be the most kind of helpful. After 5 years now, is it 5 years, 6 years of doing this, through experience, self-learning, and just getting a lot of kind of advising and mentoring from people who are more experienced, I feel like I don't have any problem talking with many MBAs. Do I know everything about how to do pricing strategy? Do I know everything about B2B sales, business to business sales? Maybe not, but like the thing that we have as a humanist is the ability to learn, right? We have this incredible ability to learn, especially kind of general principles and be able to apply them. And I think that's really essentially important, right? So being open to that. I think the other key component, I mentioned MBA is, okay, maybe if you transition, you think about doing a, programming degree or going to that, yes, that might be helpful, but it's not indispensable to do. I know I'm a non-technical founder. I know many other people who also don't code at a high level, professional level, and certainly can be helpful, but it doesn't mean you necessarily have to go and do that as well, right? You have to kind of pick and choose where you decide to move into. And there have been some people who've transitioned very well into being able to use that skill set, but not everyone can, right? So part of it is recognizing what will be most useful. And one great example I use is a friend of mine who also is a historian, decided not to go and continue in the academic job market, and decided that, okay, I'm going to use part of this kind of postdoc, part of what I have available afterwards, to retrain myself in data analytics. So he brought that as an additional tool that he could offer, right? It doesn't mean you go and learn everything, that you kind of get a very kind of general person. He focused really into that. And that specialization has been absolutely indispensable to him, especially getting his foot into first jobs, which might not have been always the best ones, first kind of non-academic industry jobs. But the experience he brought, both as a historian, but then also the one that he developed through being a data analyst, eventually has led him into a high-level position at a startup now as well. So, I often use that as an example. What do you choose to do? And I think the last kind of part here to mention, and I'm happy to talk about this a little bit more, is if you do decide to do something entrepreneurial, there are a lot of risks and challenges as well. Sometimes people make the comparison, doing a PhD is like being an entrepreneur, and entrepreneur in the basic sense means, trying to solve a problem, right? Trying to take an endeavor, take a risk to do that. There's some similarities for sure, but there are some major differences that I often caution about. And I often say, if you do choose to be an entrepreneur, be a reluctant one, because I know I was definitely a reluctant one. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that in that perspective as well. But those are kind of four areas I think are key to remember when you're thinking about the knowledge base that you want to expand and how you want to use it, especially if you're moving into this new field and new area.
Yeah, it's a really great way to parse it. Yeah, I mean, this idea of the reluctant entrepreneur, I guess on entrepreneurship by its very nature is high risk. You need to have I guess, a certain risk tolerance, I suppose they'd say in finance, right? You need to be at, I guess, the higher end of the distribution. Is that something you came in with, or were you surprised?
I was surprised. I mean, I think I spoke to a very successful startup founder and venture capitalist recently who introduced me to this term, something I've been thinking about, but she put it together very nicely, that she decided to found her company not because she wanted to, or because, I see this quite a bit, especially with much younger, obviously as being part of the startup community at Harvard, you see much younger ones and you meet other people who are in their 20s. I'm in my 40s. And you see people who want to be founders, but they don't know what problem they're solving yet. And they just know they want to be a founder. And that's great. You don't want to kind of diminish that enthusiasm. But the one thing that I remember talking with this very successful entrepreneur investor was like, I took the time to really figure out what is the problem I wanted to solve, what was something that was important to me. And with experience, with some thoughts, with some perspective, when no other solutions appeared, I then decided to take the risk to do that. And you have to be prepared for those risks: monetary, emotional, physical, family, et cetera, and it is high risk. And there are going to be many thankless days, but those days are extremely good or whatnot just outweigh those. And that's the thing you have to be prepared for. And you also have to be prepared for something not working out. 99% of startups don't work out, right? That's something I think a lot of people risk tolerance wise don't really like to consider, right? At least with a PhD, there's a way of getting to completion. There's a way of kind of getting it in, right? That's when I tell people, if you try to make that comparison too much, you can go down a kind of erroneous path. There is a very high risk of failure. And if you invest money and time and the opportunity cost of that, that is something very serious. So that's why I often say that is why these words from this particular person I spoke to resonated with me, is like, really think about that. And for me, the kind of motivating reason for me to become that was I just really felt that not enough was being done to serve academics who were underemployed or in contingent employment or underutilized given their education. And then B, that a lot of the education companies that really had a lot of sway and control over different areas were not run sufficiently by educators or didn't have that perspective. And that for me was, convinced me that this is a worthwhile risk to take. And, it was one that worked out well with the first company and then allowed me to create the second one. But it is something that was my motivation that convinced me I can't stay on the sidelines anymore. And that's something, that can only speak to my own perspective on that. But if that's something that resonates with someone here or someone else who's thinking about entrepreneurship, I do recommend that perspective and kind of talking yourself out of it a little bit if you can before you embark on a risky endeavor.
That's of course arguing both sides. In utramque partem is a famous Renaissance trope. But no, I like this very sort of measured approach to it. There are significant differences between doing a PhD and starting a company. Although I guess most significantly is the very strict institutional framework you have around you, the PhD. Although having an association with the university, I guess, is sort of there are opportunities to dip your toe in this world, often through universities. We have it at CUHK. You mentioned Harvard Business School has sort of I guess incubators.
Yeah. MIT does it as well, as a very well developed path, because they often have many people out of research. So yeah, I mean, this is something I find is very compelling, and as I mentioned, it's so dominated though by STEM, right? And for some reason, like as I mentioned, there are differences. There's certain things where the immediate practical application of a particular enzyme or technology or algorithm is sometimes maybe clearer, right? So the question I have, I love thinking about, and that's what I think about, when we're creating the kind of educational portion behind the technology of Polis, is what is this unique insight? Like for us, creating, proprietary things based on educational research is how we kind of bring that to bear, right? So we try to make it qualitative and quantitative, and some of the history part is less proprietary, but some of the applications can be, for instance, right? So that's one way of thinking, and I think that's just a very different way of how we think about as humanists, right? Like creating something that is proprietary and monetizable is, for some people I know, some of my dear friends, kind of, not something that should be as aspired to when studying the humanities. So I'm often kind of mixed about that, because I do see both sides, and I see a space for us thinking about whether or not we should monetize the humanities expertise more.
Yes, no, there's certainly a discourse that sort of separates the world of humanistic research and the business world. What did you say? There's no scholar doesn't rhyme with dollar, which I quite like. But of course, there is an intersection, and if there's a need that existing institutions aren't providing for, then of course market forces are one of the ways to actually actually, well, even tell the institutions that they need to do something.
Yeah, and I think exactly as you put it, that's our goal with Polis. It's as you know, as we've studied Renaissance, one of the things that always struck me so much, when you're reading Petrarch, right, the father of the humanists, right, is his disdain for university training and how creating a solution to what he saw as being wrong at universities outside of it is something that very much inspires me, not in the sense of like universities are the worst, but we are facing a problem. And obviously I'm thinking in the context of the US specifically, because obviously the company is based there, but it's a broader problem. Student attrition, the value of a degree, costs going rampant. I mean, especially in the US, if you look at the delta between how much tuition has increased and in actual inflation, university inflation or cost increase far exceeds inflation, right? So we have to ask ourselves, are institutions doing everything that they're capable of, or do you need, as you said, this kind of incentive from outside to change things? Hopefully, for us, we're hoping to be a partner in that change with universities. So
you're a classic disruptor.
That should be the book you write, Stuart. The classically minded disruptor based on Renaissance humanism.
Exactly. Maybe a biography of you. So I see our esteemed director, Professor Yellen, has his hand up. So I might hand over the mic. Oh, unmute.
I should probably unmute myself. That would be wise. All right, this is fantastic. Really interesting. It's great to see you. Really interesting learning about your companies and your experiences outside of academia. So I guess I have a question and a comment. No, I'm just kidding. It's not there's no comment. I have a question, and it's kind of related to your last points about learning new skills, opportunities, and experience, and just continuing our journeys, even if we leave academia. Incidentally, I kind of think that you would, if your current company doesn't work out, you would be a wonderful inspirational speaker for humanities PhD students who are worried about the job market and need kind of like an alternative course. But I guess my point is, this is a message that I think, and I don't know how many PhD students have joined us today, but this is a message that I think a lot of PhD students need to hear. So my question is this: what practical steps or practical advice do you have for students or graduate students in the humanities? What do they need to hear if they want to use the skills that they've learned in academia and apply it towards academic entrepreneurship?
Absolutely. And I think, here you might see some differences between undergraduates in humanities versus graduate students or PhDs. If I were to give general advice, first thing, seek out kind of academic internships or experiences, right? I think that's supremely important, whatever it might be, to give you kind of a basis and opportunity to apply that, right? To get a sense of how those skills are put into place, right? And that's often where you start to see that. So that's kind of the first thing I say, especially if you're a graduate student. I know, at least when we started grad school, almost 10 years ago, was it more than that? Maybe more than that now. Oh gosh, time, many more years
2006.
There was no discussion when we were starting that you would do something else, right? And that has changed significantly, right? I've had the opportunity to kind of talk with students. Students are thinking about that and seeking out in their summers or in addition to their coursework, some experience, non-academic job experience that helps you gain those skills that you can then show on a resume if you do go to a alt-ac, I don't usually like to use that term, or a non-academic employer, right? So you apply for consulting or some other area of industry where you can show, I have these skills that, when I think of humanities, that's what's usually associated: soft skills, teamwork, collaborative, inclusive leadership, et cetera, where you build these kind of very concrete skills and stories that you can talk about to potential employers. So that's the first thing I would say is very, very important. And I think particularly when we think about even an area like digital humanities, where you do start to acquire some of those more STEM skills as auxiliaries. I often think of as an auxiliary discipline to many primary disciplines. It can be extremely helpful to bring that to bear or to acquire certain things. I know, one of my very dearest friends acquired a whole knowledge of programming to complement his study of medieval history. And should he actually choose to go into more of that, he'd be able to go into more industry areas, he could apply that skill. So that's the second area, thinking about, okay, whatever you're studying, is there something you can add to it, right, during the course of your study? And it really is ideal. You know, if I talked with my friend who left and then did the data analytics training outside of university, it gets a little bit trickier because you're thinking about job, you're thinking about support. So if there is an opportunity to acquire some unique skill that really makes you stand out, or, you know, as I think as the comedian Steve Martin used to kind of say, it makes it hard for someone to ignore you, so good that you can't be ignored. Think about some of those things, right? Obviously, there's your research component, there's your teaching, but if you can acquire that skill, that non-academic skill of some sort that suits what you're interested in, go after that as well, in addition to the internship. And then I think the last thing that is just so important, and probably more important than the other things, relationship building. That is going to be absolutely essential to you and where you want to go next, right? Whether you call it networking, whether you call it socializing, whether you call it whatever it be, finding those people who can provide that mentorship, that connection, people in different areas that you can talk to is just so important. You know, those weak links in those networks that you form through that can be much more consequential and even lead you to what you need to do to be prepared for a job in the industry that they're in. I can't underestimate. And I every time I look back, and I've been blessed to have many wonderful people that I connected with, but I always look back and say, I could have done more. I could have met more people. I could have connected really amazing people. It's not for instrumental purposes, but it's also a way of better informing yourself for what is out there. And I would say those are the three kind of important things: outside internships, experiences, skills to complement, and relationship building.
Yeah, so I guess you're also telling me what I can do for my advisees. But do you have any specific advice for advisors as well? Because well, I can tell my students to seek out non-academic internships. Well, I guess I could just give them your advice. Is there any specific advice that for me as to how I can help my advisees on their journey?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think one thing is familiarize yourself with whatever the needs of the market are. I think that's one thing that I see as a big difference. I think more and more advisors are doing that. Like, what are the kind of trajectories? And I think you all, I think most of us our age, in our age group, are familiar kind of or aware of what's out there, the challenges. I think the second thing is, if you can connect with OCS, develop some sort of relationship, Office of Career Services, or Career Services, as a way of being able to connect to resources that are available at your institution, being mindful, know someone in particular that you can bring in or regularly share, I think is extremely important. I have a wonderful relationship with Harvard's OCS that has been just very helpful, very useful, especially in mentoring graduate students in particular, right? I think that's the second thing. And then I think the third thing is just being open to different possibilities. I think with undergraduates, most people are. I don't think most people are encouraging in the same way undergraduates to go into graduate training without understanding the risks of the job market. But I think this is also something that's shift. You know, whenever you have a graduate student who comes to you who's thinking of not going in academia, being open to that. You know, I've heard so many stories from graduate students being afraid to tell their advisor that they're thinking about not going into academia, or they feel like it might be a betrayal. I think just having that, you know, psychological support and knowing that no matter what you choose, I will support you so you get to that professional happy place that you want to be. I think those are kind of the three kind of key components that I would say are important and essential for advisors.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I have a bunch of PhD advisees right now, and I told them very clearly, do not come to academe, but they still came anyways. So I actually have needed a lot of help with this. I mean, because I can tell them that, you know, the chances of getting a job in a place that you want to live, in the field that you want to work in, is very difficult. But then I can't make the next leap and tell them, well, what other options are there available to them and how can they do this? So this is actually helpful for me as well.
Thank you. I'm always happy to help and suggest, because I think this is just such a, I mean, exactly. When people, undergraduates, come to me and ask me, will you write a letter for grad school? I usually say, well, why? Why exactly do you want to do this? Not in a facetious way, but I think exactly your point, like, you know, why are you doing this? And, you know, the question might be, you know, if we do have people who continue? Because there's a question also of continuity of discipline, right? Like I know some people say we still have to accept graduate students because at some point there might be a scarcity if we don't continue this, right? My suggestion would be like, does your program have an alternative plan in place for them? Should they, earn the degree, which can still be valuable, and be able to then move into, say, a non-academic thing? I think that's something I've seen from discussions with people at other graduate programs who are thinking about that precisely. Like, do you have already a structure in place, whether it's a different type of dissertation or capstone, whether it's, different,
That's a good idea.
not different requirements, but different kind of prioritization of advising, perhaps, right? So that might be something really, really super interesting, an opportunity to create something for them that they might not have thought of, right?
Yeah, that's actually very interesting. Hadn't thought of that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I might have mentioned that we have a new digital humanities course here that I've been teaching, and I've been trying to use it to some extent to help students break out of the normal kind of classroom mindset, at least. So we do group, everything's based on collaboration. They have to decide on division of labor. They're given, we have a larger topic, and then they have to say, create digital maps and sort of come up with some insights. That's what I'm always sort of pushing them to do. And maybe next year or the year after, we'll have a course with a Python component as well, to introduce the students to a little bit of programming. That's sort of some of the groundwork we're trying to lay, especially because Hong Kong, as you know, is right across from Shenzhen, and there's a kind of a push overall towards all things
competition.
Yes, well, exactly. Well, I mean, it's provide the students with future opportunities, essentially.
Yeah, of course.
Essentially. So do you have any advice, perhaps, say, for actual classroom teaching? Are there things that you wish that you had been sort of encouraged to do within, not just internships, but also kind of a different mentality maybe to develop within the classroom?
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. I think, when I look back in retrospect, and, luckily a lot of my own teaching even has evolved, because I still teach at the extension school and I work with professional students who are constantly always asking. I think this is the difference when you work with older students with that. How do you answer? So what's the so what career-wise of what I'm learning, right? And I think acknowledging that from the beginning strategically is just so important. And then working to implement that within action. I think, as you described with your assignments, those are exactly great ways of preparing people and priming people for that, right? Being familiar with that. Like, you can't, someone who's a humanist who's only taking up programming late will never necessarily, like, it's very rare, very hard to get to the same degree of programming fluency that someone who's been doing it since they're 8. My CTO has been doing it since he was extremely young, and it's just like, flows naturally, but it isn't something that you don't continue learning. You learn different languages, whatnot. So I think keeping that in mind is really important. Having that fluency not only in spoken languages, which I think is essential also, allowing them to try new tools. But I would say also, I remember I heard this from a former student of mine who's now a VC. He basically said that historians don't tinker enough. Right, this is an important concept in startups and tech. Tinkering, you tinker a little bit, where you're okay with putting out a hypothesis rather than a polished argument. Right, we're very much like that often in humanities, that we don't show our tinkering stage so much, but in the final paper or the final article, that we kind of we articulate an argument that seems to at least present as more definite. Right, even though it's not. We're very much open for someone disagreeing. I would say, like, one thing that it's good that you described from these activities and whatnot is the ability to allow humanists to tinker and to be okay with that, because that, I think, really does prime people well for some of those other jobs, especially in tech, to be okay with that, to understand the mentality of more tech-driven people, technical people as well, right? I think that is really quite essential. And I think the example you gave with Python is great. Mathematica is another great one. That's one I know I've used with computational philology. Which is a lot of fun. It's different than more engineering program, but it's like, the more you can be exposed and familiar and not afraid of it. Because what you want to teach, and I don't know if people would agree with this, is that sometimes there is a zero-sum game mentality between humanities and STEM, I don't think it needs to be like that, right? There might be more of a preference in one area, but how can we incorporate familiarity and a lack of angst about that other subject, I think is important, right? I see that from technical people who sometimes are afraid about writing or presenting or whatnot. Not that necessarily in the humanities we do that better. Some of us do. But I think from the humanities side, not to be afraid of what STEM has to offer, right? And I think exactly the example you give is a phenomenal way of getting your graduates started with them.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, if nothing else, these courses, show people different ways of thinking about the world, and that just because it has the word digital in front of it, it doesn't mean you can't do it because you don't have a CS degree. Actually, everything is learnable, and your level of understanding to work with something is actually the barrier to entry is probably lower than you think.
Exactly.
And,
I think that's the thing that we particularly have. I mean, this is a human, but I think this is what equips us well. I've always said, like, there's nothing that I can't learn the basic fundamentals of. I might not be able to do it as well as an experienced programmer, but I can understand as an intelligent person that. I think that's one of our super skills or super strengths as humanists, is that ability to understand and to ask those analytical questions and to learn practically anything, right? So.
And would you agree with the proposition that humanities are too sort of focused on individual work as opposed to group work? You mentioned this lack of tinkering, sort of the completed project, but it tends to be a sort of a completed individual project, as opposed to something which involves working with the most irritating animal of all, the human.
I think we need to do that more. I think of our own, the fact that we co-wrote an article on cannibalism together.
That's
right?
true. Yes.
For instance, and that was, much better for it. I think we definitely need to do that, because that's also something that employers look for. There's the stereotype of, many stereotypes in PhDs, even PhDs in STEM, where you're seen as more solitary. You're not a team player. And that is important to learn those abilities to collaborate, to make compromises, to accept that you might only get 80% of what you want, or maybe 75% of what you want, right? I think those are all such valuable skills that, are what I hear from the other side, from people who are more employer-based or have certain kind of prejudice from the investment side, is that, well, academics, or especially humanists, they just work in their little bubble and they don't know how to be team players, right? And we can break that stereotype much more and be okay with sharing that process and working with others and tinkering together. I think that's fun, and we have examples of that. Some of the best people do that. I think of people who work in cross-disciplinary areas, right? They often have to do that very much, right? I think it's a good thing to do and to approach that thing. And it's almost a revival of the old kind of German university model, right? So where you have units of people working together and not just simply thinking that's something of the STEM or the sciences, natural sciences or STEM, but also in the social sciences and the human sciences as well, right?
Absolutely. And actually, even on the research side, we're being encouraged to do that more. Our research grant agency here in Hong Kong has lots of collaborative grants where you're supposed to put together a team. So even on the research side, it's becoming increasingly important, but it's maybe not something we're teaching or exposing students to. There's sort of a lag.
Exactly. I think you hit the nail on the head, and I see this in the US, I see this in Canada, where my wife is a professor, where they apply for joint grants together, and like she encourages that, but it's an exception rather than a rule. And I think exactly as you say, and this is something I know many other people who do this, like, how do you teach that, right? It's one thing to say that you want that, but how do you actually teach people, humanists, to collaborate well with each other, right? I think that's exactly something we have to do, and we have to create opportunities for that, right? I think that's the key thing, to be able to do that.
And we have to give up our pride as well, because we don't necessarily trust each other. Will they come to the same understanding? Are they reading the documents correctly? Are they understanding things correctly?
That's true. And
that drives a wedge.
Exactly. And how do you get rated for it? I think one reason also is that when you look at what is the marker of tenure or ref or whatever your assessment of merit might be at your institution, you're not rewarded for co-writing articles, right? They often divide it up, or there's, especially among historians, right? There's not a real celebration of that collaborative spirit. So, that's also something that has to change from the departmental and administrative level as well. How do you reward people for that type of collaboration in practice, right? Rather than denigrating it, which I've often seen, is like, oh, well, you co-wrote this. Well, that's not really, that shouldn't count as much as something that you wrote alone, right? So.
I also find that in the classroom that as the students are a little bit wary of doing group projects because of the potential pitfalls and pulling down their grade in some way.
Yeah, it's a massive problem. It's a massive. I mean, whether it's peer review when I do that, whether it's, I mean, it's something. I mean, the reality, the problem is that the challenge here that we have, and I don't know if I have all the, I don't know if I have the solution per se from what I've said, but I think the challenge that we need to address is how do we get students in an academic environment, right, which is supposed to be in some ways a preparatory one for life, right, to feel comfortable collaborating when we know this is the thing that's sought after, right? And obviously now it's a little bit also, we have in work questions about, should we have enough meetings? How does collaboration look at working at home, et cetera, right? So that can take many different forms. You don't necessarily have to collaborate in like person and whatnot, but whether it's remotely, whether it's digitally, whether it's asynchronously, how do you form good collaborations in groups? I think learning that skill is just so tricky. And I actually feel like I don't feel like we learned enough of that even when we were younger, whether it's undergraduates or as graduates, enough. So I hope new generations will learn to feel more comfortable with that, because that's, I can just tell you that's what we look for when we work with people. So.
Yeah. I mean, all of my educational experiences really favored the lone wolf. That's very much the very much the model. But if say you want to build a platform like Polis, you need somebody like you with your understanding of education and entrepreneurship. You need somebody to do some of the technical aspects of the building. And potentially many other people as well. And it's just the truth that one person, can't do it, or can't do it in the right amount of time.
Yeah.
You could do it in 5 years, but the need is next week.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's no good in 5 years.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, that's, to be fair, I mean, there are a lot of also challenges in the startup world as well for founders. I know one of the biggest challenges that many startup founders face is finding a co-founder, right? A co-founder you can work with, that you can agree to good terms, equity-wise, work division-wise, work style-wise. That is something that is a challenge, right? Like I don't want to over-idealize anything, but it is a challenge that many people face there as well. And I think also, there is a trend a little bit now towards the solopreneur, which has been kind of made available through platforms that have simplified the coding process or enable you to kind of put together, what we call minimal viable products, MVPs of platforms that you can test or you can basically outsource to people, right? And part of it comes from people having bad working experiences and founders. And it's just very, it's also very challenging. I don't want to say that it isn't something that people in that area don't face, but it is something that people also encounter. And there are trends towards some of that. So, I don't know. I mean, I think for any kind of sustainable, successful startup that I've seen, and I've seen the numbers and data sets, ones that disproportionately do well are ones that have multiple founders who work together. It doesn't mean you have to always agree, but you do have a productive relationship of support where people pick up the thing. And solopreneurs often tend to burn out quite quickly, unfortunately, right?
Oh, yeah, that's a risk, certainly. Do you happen to have any names of these platforms that people, so the kind of the non-coding platforms?
Oh my goodness, there are a few I remember looking at together. Let me see if I can remember one off the top. And there's so many now. There was one I remember I was looking at with my CTO just out of curiosity. Oh my goodness. I can always send it to you. I can't think off the top of my head right now, but there are several, and they're very. I'm not trying to kind of denigrate them, and they're very useful and helpful, especially when you're trying to solve specific things or create a particular platform for a community. They're extremely helpful. So I'll give you an example. for a marketplace, there's a share tribe is one where you can create a marketplace based on subscription. You pay subscription, you create a marketplace for people to use to exchange goods. So you could create essentially your own Airbnb with low code or no code at all. There is a version where you use that is code based that you do need a developer to help with, but that's an example of that. Oh my goodness, I remember looking at quite a few of them now, but I think I'm just blanking. I'll have to follow up with that, but I'll send you a few that are interesting. And it's from a variety of different areas. Like I'm thinking marketplaces, that's what I'm interested in personally, because that's what we use tech-wise as the back structure of the entire platform. But you have it for many other different types, SaaS things that you can create potentially. You know, there's a limit to what you can do with no code, but there are a lot of really cool platforms out there that automate a lot of the process for you to be able to do. So
yeah, we're organizing a hackathon in April. And I'm thinking of I was initially thinking of having a sort of an AI activity, but if there could be something a little bit more, I guess sort of maybe create a marketplace or something sort of interesting for the students to do in 3 hours, 2 hours.
Yeah, I would suggest the Share Tribe is a Share Tribe Go. That's what it's called. As a particular platform that you could use. Bubble, that's the other one I was thinking of. Bubble is a very good one, which allows you to create a variety of bubble.io. That's another good one that you could potentially use as well. So fantastic.
Lots of really great ideas, but yeah, both for the students and for the professors at this.
I suggest. I mean, this is what I suggest.
Like,
they're really good if you're thinking about before you spend $10, $20, $50, $100,000 of money. Create a prototype. You know, that's what we did also with our platform. We created a low prototype that I wouldn't necessarily show now. But it really helped validate some basic principles. You create it with a no-code thing, whether it's something like Bubble, something like Share Tribe Go for a marketplace. You play around with it. You create some fake profiles. You get some real people on there. You see how people interact. You see what you need. You know, do you solve a basic problem with it? It's a really great way of doing it, and I think it's amazing how quickly you can set up the basic components of it. Essentially,
Fascinating.
So,
yeah,
that's what they're useful for.
No, that's a really great insight. And I guess you need to develop that sort of tinkering and sort of testing mentality as well, which is something.
Actually, I'll just share something that I had up as well in the chat for people here. Just some example of various no-code apps and tools that you can use basically. So I'll send it in the chat to everyone here as well. Because those are one of the things that are extremely useful. And then you come up with something, you go meet people who might help you. That's, very much for me, I went through, even my own process of starting Polis, went through previous potential founders. There are things that logistically or otherwise didn't work. And eventually, I was able to turn to someone who was part of our graduate experience, the graduate coordinator. You remember Matt Corcoran, obviously. So he became one of my co-founders.
Oh, wow.
And through him, small world, right? You meet someone. That's why I said relation. Yeah, he's one of my co-founders. Exactly. We ended up working together, trying out different things, realized we had a great idea together. And then he knew someone, our CTO, who was interested in doing something different technically than sending rockets into space and working in biotech. And we got together. We went into a bar. What's a joke? A historian, a PR comms biotech executive, and a software engineer go into the bar. I don't know what the punchline is, but what we came out with was Polish. So, it was a great thing for building that and figuring out whether we want to work. And 3 years later, we've created something really great that's growing and really becoming more and more impactful. And hopefully we'll scale the impact even more in the new year, which is exciting. So, but it does take that kind of relationship, which I really emphasize is important, right? Even more than other things, because you're not going to be able to get anywhere, whether it's clients, whether it's potential investors, whether it's contacts, without those relationships.
And how do you decide? So you mentioned you had sort of 2 companies or 2 projects. How do you decide when to move on to the next one, and how do you move on to something new? Because I guess it's not always obvious.
No, that's exactly right. So with CHG, there are a couple of very natural things that progress it to evolve. It started as a consultancy, basically a talent agency for educators, connecting them with paid opportunities, right? And obviously that works well when on-site components are easy to do or relatively easy to do. You don't have visa or travel disruptions, and you don't have a pandemic, right? So even before those things happened, we knew that we were reaching kind of a bottleneck in terms of placing people as widely and as quickly as we wanted in terms of opportunities. And we realized, okay, well, why don't we build a marketplace to clear and open up more educators to being potentially engaged? So we started building that. We were already transitioning. We fortunately had the revenue to do that. So we kind of transformed that all in. And obviously the pandemic accelerated things enormously, right? So that's when we really decided to fully transition everything out of on-site and more kind of in-person components that was part of CHG into Polis, which is an educational technology company, right? To really focus on the platform and create those opportunities through that. And that was kind of what prompted, right? There was a certain kind of business concerns, but then also epidemiological concerns of that, and then you adapt to those circumstances and you do that. And sometimes you have to do that. You have to be willing to pivot and kind of close or evolve a company into something new. And if something doesn't work, you have to also be prepared to close it, right? Failure is extremely high. I knew several people whose companies also just went bust because they were completely based on on-site activities, right? A lot of the companies that CHG worked with, international educational companies, were completely based on one region, or completely based on one model. So if the in-person and travel disappears, you have no revenue, right? So we were already kind of preparing what will kind of mitigate those changes, right? And for us, building a platform was a way of doing that, and transforming into something new was really essential in that sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the, a college that I'm connected to at Oxford had to make a similar pivot during the pandemic regarding their summer school. They had an in-person summer school that was very, very popular. That was no longer possible, so they decided to create a summer online tutorial program. They didn't want students sitting through online lectures, because who wants to do that in the summer? And instead they sort of put online the kind of Oxford tutorial model that's very interactive, and you're constantly being challenged. So I guess they were reacting to the same forces, which was both a sort of disastrous event, and also I guess a great sort of font of opportunities as well.
Absolutely. Some of those summer programs are absolute cash cows for universities, right? Like that's absolutely huge. And you see now even, with I wouldn't say post-pandemic, but in the course of this pandemic and how things are going, you see universities hybridizing their options. Many in the US public are creating both virtual and in-person options and opening it up. I always say, like, the extension school at Harvard was one of the best prepared for the pandemic, because they had already transitioned to all virtual. They had gotten me even to teach all of my courses virtually. And, by opening up to a wider public or making it more accessible, they were able to increase revenue, right? They're one of the few parts of Harvard that are in the black, so to speak, revenue wise, right? And part of that is because of that model that was already well developed for the change. Not that they had foreseen the pandemic, but they're already well equipped. And that's something you always think about in terms of whether your university or your business, what is the business model, right? Because I think for better, for worse, universities also are a form of business or a form of corporation, right? Especially if we look at the original term of university too, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. And it is the Harvard Corporation after all.
It's true.
So.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah, that's interesting, and sort of combined with a move towards what they call modularization as well. Online specific courses that people can take as a kind of micro credential when they have a particular need, as opposed to the larger degree program. Appears to be something of a model at the moment.
And that's something I think there's something that we do in terms of that. We do it much more with office hours. That's kind of one of our key components and offerings that we use in terms of modularity, if you want to use that term. But I think breaking those things down, whether you're enrolled in a course or not, and kind of creating access to information or something that you need to learn, especially once you graduate, once you're beyond that, it's just so important. And that's why, you know, one of the areas of my own research that evolved was moving into adult learners, right? People who are post undergraduate, essentially, right? You have some work experience, or you have different needs or more experience, right? You know, it's a whole other way of teaching as well, andragogy instead of pedagogy, right? Teaching of adults with very different needs. I think that's something I see in this particular area as being important and moving forward is when you think about this modular, the breaking down of learning, how are you enabling lifelong learning, essentially, right? So, so I don't know if any of us, I mean, you know, I don't know if any of us would have the energy to do another PhD again, or to do an MBA even, or any other degree, right, at this particular life phase. But it's very different for those that, you know, younger or older. You know, I know older people who are in their 60s, 70s who want to do that, right? They've come to a certain point in their life where they want to experience that thing. And I think being conscious of the needs and kind of interests of people at different age points and whatnot is just something that will be a part of us in terms of thinking of the future of learning, but also the future of work, right? Because I think those two are interconnected tremendously. People treat them as separate, but I don't think you can in many respects.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. So looking at the time here, I see we could talk for hours as ever. Michael, Dr. Tworek is a very engaging interlocutor, as we've all learned in the last hour and a half. But maybe we'll just ask one final question. So we've heard a little bit about your trajectory. What's next for Dr. Tworek?
The great question. What's next for us? So we're starting the new year. We're hoping for some very exciting developments. We obviously have several clients that we have, and we hope to bring on fully onto the platform. So we work with institutional clients, universities, organizations. So that's one of our kind of big priorities that I'm working on right now. Recruiting educators, bringing on board different changes. So that's kind of one of the big priorities of Polis. As a historian, I'm trying to finish a book that I think Stu has heard quite a bit about how looking at travelers from Poland around the world helps us rethink early modern globalization. I'm hoping to have that done and kind of worked on as well, that kind of scholarly perspective as well. As I mentioned, from personally, I'm adding a new addition to my family, so I think that's something ahead for me as well. And then obviously, you know, my startup in some ways is my creative endeavor. It's like what I see is kind of a fusion of my academic stuff and all that. And I think one of the things that we're hoping to do is really like scale. This will be the year where after 3 and so years of stealth, we're able to kind of expand and go public much more fully. So that's one of the big kind of goals to coincide all those other things. And hopefully those 3 things and the time management that I put in place that sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, will allow me to get there. But those are the kind of major areas on those fronts. So I'm quite excited about it. And yeah, I mean, it's many challenges, many, you know, challenging things going on, but I think this kind of focusing on these kind of things, creating opportunities to be impactful, can be really some of the best ways to move forward and hopefully make a better future for all of us.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I've learned a lot. I've been frantically taking notes, and I'm sure everyone else has as well. It's all been tremendously inspiring and engaging. So I guess
so much.
all that remains is to give a final thanks to our speaker and to all those of you who've attended over the last term or so, to Kitty Sue at the library and her other colleagues, and to our administrator Baz Malok, who's done sterling work behind the scenes over the last term or so. We are all very grateful, and we hope to see you all at our events next year.
Thank you.
Okay.
Take care, everyone.
Bye,
Have a wonderful
everyone.
day. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.